Studio by the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott. Hello to you, thanks for coming in on a Sunday morning. Now, you've obviously been in the headlines a lot over the last few weeks, and I am keen to talk about some of those issues. But first, I think we should speak about the abuse that you've experienced. And you've been in Parliament now for 30 years, the first black woman to take your seat in Parliament. You've never spoken about this before, so why have you decided to speak out now?
It's the level of abuse, particularly in recent weeks. What we were getting, and have had for some time, is almost daily abuse, being called a bitch, a nigger, rape threats, people saying I should be hanged. And it reached a particular pitch in the last few weeks. And I thought to myself, had I known it would be like this 30 years on from being elected, I'd have thought twice for running for Parliament at all.
Really, that is actually quite shocking. And I'd like to, apologise for viewers for some of the language that we are going to listen to and have heard. I think it is important, of course, to look at some of the examples of what we've actually seen. These are things that have been provided by your office, Diane Abbott. The violence in some of this language is obviously pretty shocking and appalling. A lot of it clearly is frankly racist as well. And I think it's important to say as well that these are the examples that we felt we could actually show on TV. There's stuff that is even more shocking than that in some ways. Not as a politician, but as a person, how does it make you feel when you read some of that directed at yourself?
Well, first of all, it's horrible for my staff who have to read it every day, and they're a diverse team, mostly women. For me, first of all, it kind of does get in your head. It kind of does demoralise you, and it does, even though you know it shouldn't do, it does make you doubt yourself. And when Jo Cox unfortunately was attacked and died, of course your first thought was for her children and her husband and for her friends and family and the people of Batley and Spen who lost a great MP, but you also thought, maybe this isn't all just abuse, maybe stuff can happen. So since then, I've been trying to sort out the security on my home, and my staff try not to let me walk around Hackney on my own. It's a horrible, horrible world out there.
It's really quite frightening. And you mentioned Jo Cox. I remember speaking to some other Labour female MPs who said that after that happened, their children basically asked them to quit politics because it's not worth it. The emotional impact of it must be really very heavy.
The emotional impact, both on me, the people that work for me, and also my family, is appalling. And people don't realise, because they kind of dehumanise you. So they can call you all these names. They can say you should be hanged or die in some horrible way. And I just think everybody, not just the people that, tweet, or Facebook, that stuff, but even mainstream media have to recognise they talk about women politicians and black politicians in a different way.
What would you say then to a young black girl or a young black boy thinking about going into politics? Because seeing some of this must be pretty off-putting.
Well, I tell them to do it. In 30 years, I have been able to see change. I was the first Member of Parliament made a speech about Stephen Lawrence, and I, with Bernie Grant, who was an MP at the time, and Paul Button, we took Doreen Lawrence to meet Jack Straw when Labour was still in opposition, and she completely swept him away. And as a consequence, we had the Macpherson inquiry. So you can make change, you can make a difference. But I think it's very, very sad that you're seeing this horrible abuse. And I actually think internet providers could do more. Facebook and Twitter, they're American companies. They believe in First Amendment rights, right to freedom of speech. But no one really has a right to peddle this racist and sexist abuse.
So what needs to happen then? Do you think a parliamentary inquiry, for example, into racist and sexist abuse would help?
I think there's probably a case for a parliamentary inquiry, but partly to make internet providers do more to close down these people. My colleague, Luciana Berger, in the end, they found a guy that was directing anti-Semitic abuse at her, and he was charged and convicted. But there's so many more of these people out there, and what they're doing is they're poisoning the political debate, and they're putting off, I think, particularly young women from even getting involved in the political debate online, and they must be putting off some women from getting involved in politics.
I spoke to one other MP about this who suggested that there was a sort of radicalisation, if you like, going on of white men on the internet. Do you think that's happening?
I think it's become turbocharged. When I was a new MP, if you wanted to send racist abuse, you wrote a letter, you know, in green ink usually, and you got maybe 1 or 2 of those letters a week. Now you can press a button and threaten to rape somebody, and the more they see, the more some of these guys see this stuff online, the more they feel encouraged and emboldened, and it's become turbocharged, and it's become worse, and it's almost as if they want to drive some of us out of politics.
Is there a sort of camaraderie among other Labour MPs? Do you feel that other women in Parliament have supported you?
I think I've had a lot of support from Labour women MPs in recent weeks, and I'm very glad of that. I think we all have to stand together, because it is a concerted attempt to delegitimise women in politics. First of all, you marginalise the women that are most outspoken, and then you frighten other women out of saying the same things.
I think certainly, actually, when I said that you were a guest on the programme, I think the level of the response I received was more strong than any other politician I've had on this programme, which I thought was perhaps quite an interesting illustration.
Well, it's indicative. I'm quite happy to engage in political debate. I'm quite happy to engage in quite fiery political debate. But we're not talking about political debate here. We're talking about racism and sexism and abuse. And there's no case for that.
Have you ever been tempted to quit? You know, had one of those wobbles when you thought, actually, it's not worth it?
I did have a wobble a few years ago. I can't remember. It was some horrible press story. And I rang Keith Vaz, who went to Parliament with me in 1987. And Keith was quite brisk. He said, Diane, you have forgotten what it took for us to get here. And he kind of gave me a sort of emotional shake, gave me some advice. But I suppose because it took so much, people forget what it was like when I came in 87. I was the only black woman MP. You hardly ever saw even a black admin person or secretary. I remember a few months in 87, I had a friend for tea, and she said to me, Diane, do you realise that everybody is staring at you as you walk around? And I hadn't, because my thing is just to get on with the job. So I'm saddened in a way that I have to raise these issues all these years later.
Do you think that Labour has a bit of an issue with women? I'm asking you this because you ran for the Labour leadership, of course, on quite a similar platform in some ways to Jeremy Corbyn. You came last. When he ran as a white man in 2015, he won in the first round.
I wouldn't want to say anything about Jeremy, but I think that some people do have an issue with women in politics, and they're not even examining the issue. They'll say things like, in response to some of the abuse I've had recently, it's like, oh, well, she's asked for it, don't worry about her feelings. People need to examine, even including some of our colleagues, how they talk about and how they regard women colleagues.
You talk about some of your colleagues. The example that, of course, comes to mind is the Brexit Secretary, David Davis. His text messages about you appeared on the front pages of the Mail on Sunday, saying that he wouldn't hug you because he's not blind. I mean, are those the kind of comments that you're talking about?
That, but also the fact that the Mail on Sunday made it a front page story, and there were 2 pages inside about it. And it was all about denigrating and belittling me. This is my point. It's not just the things that you hear on the internet, it's also the way the media acts as an echo chamber for some of it.
That's interesting. Were you upset by David Davis's comments in particular, or was it just the coverage?
I wouldn't want to comment on David Davis at all.
That's fair enough. Well, thank you for being so candid about your experiences as an MP. I'm hoping you'll be equally candid about some of the challenges ahead for the Labour Party. Now, a few weeks ago, we had the second reading of Article 50, so one of the most important parliamentary moments where MPs got to vote on whether Brexit should go ahead, if the process should be started. Now, Nick Bowles, the Conservative MP, went to that vote in a wheelchair after receiving chemotherapy for a tumour in his head. you missed the vote because you had a migraine, even though you'd spoken in a debate earlier and that there were pictures of you being in the pub the night before. What honestly happened there?
What honestly happened was I was allowed to go home because I had a migraine, and there were other people who missed the vote. George Osborne missed the vote because he was doing a highly paid speech abroad. But for the third reading, which was the final vote, I was there, and I did vote to trigger Article 50 because the Labour Party believes, even though we campaign for Remain, that it's very important to take the result of the referendum seriously.
So do you think that the abuse that you got for that, compared to, say, George Osborne, was disproportionate?
Well, all I can say is that when it came to it, on the third reading, I did vote to trigger Article 50.
You did vote to trigger Article 50. Just after you made the decision, we can have a look at what you said about the vote to trigger Article 50, which is a Tory Brexit is going to be quite disastrous. If you think that Brexit is going to be disastrous, how can you look your constituents in the eye after voting in favour of it?
Because I'm a member of the Shadow Cabinet and I have to abide by the collective responsibility. It's different from being a backbench MP. There's collective responsibility. We discussed this exhaustively, and the view was, if you looked at the national picture and the fact that the majority of Labour constituencies voted for Brexit, then the feeling was we had to listen as a shadow cabinet. We had to listen to the nation as a whole. It wasn't just a question of us as individuals voting in line with our constituencies.
So did you effectively lose the argument then in shadow cabinet?
My view is that Theresa May's Brexit, which puts controlling immigration above wages, above jobs, above living standards, is absolutely the wrong type of Brexit. But obviously, Labour will continue to campaign on access to the single market.
But you voted in favour of Theresa May's Brexit, that you think all those things about.
Because I abided by a collective decision, which is what you have to do when you're in the shadow cabinet.
Someone else who's been pretty scathing about Theresa May's version of Brexit is Tony Blair, who said in the last few days that a debilitated Labour is facilitating a disastrous Brexit. We already know that you agree with Mr Blair that Brexit is going to be disastrous. And he's right, isn't he? At the moment, the Labour Party is effectively the best friend of the Conservatives.
Not at all. I mean, we actually got proportionately more of our voters out to vote for Remain than the Conservative Party did.
But you're not shaping Brexit at the moment, are you? You're voting in favour of Theresa May's idea.
Because the process has just begun in a way. We've got a really effective Brexit secretary in the shape of Keir Starmer. Jeremy Corbyn goes up and down the country explaining what the difficulties are going to be with a Tory Brexit.
But you haven't achieved anything. And if you think about it, there are very few opportunities for Parliament to actually vote and have an influence on the deal. There
will be more opportunities coming forward. Tony Blair is obviously entitled to his opinion, but I think that former Prime Ministers do better when they keep out of the Westminster debate, and I don't think his intervention has been helpful.
Now, there are two hugely important by-elections coming up in Copeland and in Stoke. In some ways, this should be a formality for Labour. They should win both of those by-elections, but of course there are fears that the Labour Party could lose at least one of them. Considering you've been so frank in this interview, if Labour does lose one of those by-elections, do you think that Jeremy Corbyn should consider his position? Would you have any doubts over his leadership?
These are difficult by-elections. They're going to be quite tight. We are hopeful of winning both of them, but it's really important that every Labour supporter comes out to vote. And if we lose one or we lose both, I think the party will go forward. It has to go forward. These are
no questions over Jeremy Corbyn's leadership then, if he loses one?
No. I mean, there are people who've been opposed to Jeremy from the very beginning. I'm not one of them. And I think we have to move forward.